CPD Show. Hi there, my name is Chris and I'll be your host for today. And today my guest is Grace Bloxham from Through the Roof. Through the Roof is a registered charity that exists to transform lives through Jesus with disabled people. The charity's name comes from the biblical account where some men broke through the roof to help their disabled friend meet Jesus. That's in Luke chapter 5. Through the Roof recognize that every person is made in the image of God and has inherent value and worth, which includes people who have different experiences of disability as well. Grace, welcome to the show. It's great to have you and to talk with you today.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Brilliant. Well, I'm really looking forward to just to talking all things about Through the Roof and talking about how we can look at sort of disability in the church. But of course, as is tradition with this show, it's very important that we talk about not just about things that are going to be developmental, but also I think things that are going to be quite tasty. And so that for that reason, we always ask every single guest, what is your favorite dessert? So Grace, what is your favorite dessert?
Oh, well, I do have an answer for this. I don't know if it counts as dessert. I really like cake, which is a bit
Okay.
controversial because some people don't view cake as dessert, but for me, cake is dessert. So chocolate cake, carrot cake, red velvet cake, they're probably like my top three. And to make it more kind of desserty, you can have it with cream or ice cream. But yeah, I don't really have like a specific thing like apple pie or something. Some people think
Right.
that apple pie is like really desserty. So yeah, anything to do with cake is my kind of thing. Is that a dessert? Does
Yeah.
that class as a dessert?
Well, clearly it does because it's not savory first of all, unless you're
Oh,
talking
that's
about
true.
like yeah. But I mean, it is an interesting one when we think about cake because it's often one of those things that happens sort of mid afternoon with a cup of tea kind of situation. I
Yeah.
think it's perfectly acceptable as a dessert as well. For me, it perfectly fits into that category. Although very interesting that you mentioned about cream with cake. As it's got to be a specific type of cake, I'm thinking.
Yeah, so I'm thinking like if you have a chocolate fudge cake, and sometimes they're like quite nice warm because it makes the icing like melty and nice and
Yes.
chocolatey. That with a bit of cream is delicious. Maybe that's just my family. I don't know. We're very much a cream with cake kind of people.
Okay.
But yeah, that's what we get. Well, only really cream if there's not a lot of icing on the cake. That's
I see.
if the
Yes.
cake is like too dry, then you do need a bit of like cream to soften it a little bit.
You do. You do need something that's just going to be a texture change, and I think cream could, I think, certainly do the job. I think it's an excellent choice, and actually
Thank you.
something that no one has actually said so far. That
Oh, really?
well, I think we may have had one person on the podcast talk about cake before, but I don't think no, I don't think I can actually remember one specific person to talk about cake. So it is a first. Who'd have
Oh,
thought that of
that's
all
great.
out of the many podcasts that I've run doing this, that no one has ever brought up cake as a dessert. So I think that's great, brilliant idea, and it is making me slightly hungry for cake. Um, uh,
Yeah.
so before we move on, obviously, so you talked about a chocolate fudge cake. Is that your, if we're going to say cake, is that what you're thinking here, rather than like a Victoria sponge or a carrot cake, or what are you thinking?
I think my go-to at the moment is a chocolate fudge cake. A nice kind of rich chocolatey fudge cake that's warmed up a little bit of cream or a bit of ice cream. That's my go-to. I'm not really a plain kind of boring cake person. I do
Okay.
like a bit of icing, bit of chocolate. Yeah, that's my cake, I think. There you go. That's
Yeah.
my cake of choice.
Yeah, good choice. Good choice. I think a sort of a chocolate fudge cake. Yeah, great choice. Bit of cream as well, like you said. Very good. I think that's an excellent choice. Brilliant. Okay, well, we are not just here to talk about dessert, as probably as much as I feel like if I ever start a second podcast in my life, it's probably just going to be a dessert
About
podcast.
dessert, yeah.
And actually, people talk to me about the podcast and they say, "Oh, you must really just eat dessert all the time." And I don't just eat dessert all the time, but I do obviously clearly like dessert because I'm happy to talk about it quite a lot. So,
Person.
sorry. So say that again. Sorry.
Are you a dessert person yourself, or
Oh,
do you
yes.
prefer savory food?
Well, I think the answer is yes to both. So I like savory food, sweet food. Yeah, it's a big yes to all of it. So yes, I like I just tend to like all food, but I do like dessert. Yeah. So I think normally if I go to a restaurant, I would tend to be main and dessert, but I
Yeah,
could be tempted by that's the thing. I end up going for
starter.
the starter. Yeah, I'm a three-course meal kind of person,
Yeah.
so yeah, absolutely. So maybe I've got to start a starters sort of one as well. What's your favorite starter? Not quite as
Oh yeah.
interesting, I don't think, but we'll.
No, no. You're more limited with starters, I think, aren't you? But
Yes,
desserts,
it's
there's
a
a
good
whole
point.
range of things.
There's a whole range, and there's different types, there's different varieties, there's different genres. It's brilliant. So yeah, it is working really well. Brilliant, Grace. Let's move on, and we're going to talk today about Through the Roof. And so, just let's start by telling me a bit about your journey and what led you to start working with Through the Roof.
Yeah, of course. So, oh, well, is that my journey to faith or is that my journey to through the roof or both? What would
Well,
you
let's
like
do.
to
I'm
know?
happy to do both. That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, well, I suppose both of those things start kind of in my childhood. So I grew up in a Christian household with very devoted parents, attended a small family-oriented church, and was encouraged from an early age to kind of develop my own personal relationship with Jesus. Um, yeah, like I said, grew up going to church. My faith journey wasn't always easy. I haven't met many people who have had a very easy faith journey, but I'm very grateful for God's faithfulness and goodness in my life, and yeah, for the support of my family through difficult times. Um, my journey to through the roof, I suppose it does start kind of in childhood, but it also starts at university, because I was when I was thinking about where to go for university. I felt God calling me to London School of Theology to study a degree in theology, which was very nerve-wracking because I grew up in a small town in Cumbria. So to move to the big city of London was quite a massive thing for me to do. But I absolutely loved university life. I learned a lot about my identity in Christ. I learned a lot about God's character, God's heart for people. And because it was a Christian university, I saw that really beautifully kind of reflected in the community that was there. I met my husband there, which was a nice little bonus. And I also wrote a piece of academic work on disability and the church, which led to my work with Through the Roof. And the reason why I did that goes back to my childhood because I grew up with my mum being in a wheelchair. So she was diagnosed with limb girdle muscular dystrophy when she was 12. She wasn't always a wheelchair user. She became a full-time wheelchair user when I was a baby. So disability and accessibility were just kind of normal parts of my life growing up. So I was very passionate about kind of issues of accessibility from a young age. So like lack of disabled toilets and ramps and lifts that actually work. And then when I was diagnosed with my own hidden disability just before I went to university, that wasn't just something that I saw my mum experience, it was something I also experienced too. So all of this kind of led to me writing that piece of academic work on disability and the church and how the church approaches disabled people and ministers kind of alongside them. And that's when I first discovered Through the Roof was during my research for that project. And after graduation, I was searching for a job and a few months of being unemployed and praying for kind of God's direction. I saw the advert for Through the Roof and I was encouraged by my mum to apply. And yeah, I spoke a lot in my interview about my dissertation, my kind of personal experience with disability, seeing kind of others' experience with disability and how they've not been valued and embraced in society or in church. And like I said, it's something I'm incredibly passionate about. And I was offered the job. So that's how I kind of came to working with Through the Roof.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, let's sort of dive into some of those sort of topics of disability within the church. What do you think? What are some of the kind of common barriers that you think that are facing people with disabilities? And we can talk about different types of disabilities as well that exist. But what are some of those sort of barriers that people with disability are facing in terms of being able to participate fully in the life of the church?
So there's a few different ones that Through the Roof we think about. The main one that most people think about is kind of the physical barriers, which is what most people tend to think of. So like the buildings not being very accessible due to a lack of adaptations. So no permanent or temporary ramp, uneven flooring, no hearing loop, and that kind of thing. And sometimes that can be because of financial limitations or the age of the building. So if a church building is a listed building, you're obviously quite limited on what you can do in terms of updating that. So that's one is the physical barriers. The next one is one that sometimes goes a bit unnoticed, I think, which is kind of the attitudinal barriers that you see within congregations at church, which is kind of negative attitudes around disabled people. So, for example, a child with autism in church being perceived as being like too noisy, or someone who needs to sit somewhere specific for their kind of access needs being perceived as, picky. And that can kind of lead to disabled people feeling quite isolated and on the edge of community, so they're not able to kind of fully belong in that church community. There's also mental and emotional barriers. So that's a barrier that um, many disabled people, like myself included, face because they themselves have some anxiety around how their different access needs will be viewed and received by the church that they're in. And that can come from having previous negative experiences in society and other churches. So if a disabled person is going to church for the first time, there's often some anxiety around that, which can limit them from being able to access church fully. And then there's also barriers to kind of serving and leading as well. So once a disabled person, kind of is in church and is welcomed into the church family and feels as though they fully belong there, um, the next kind of step, isn't it, is to get people involved in ministry. But often when it comes to serving in different areas of church ministry, there can be a bit of pressure for disabled people, particularly because in some ministry areas, kind of your level of commitment and your fruitfulness is measured in kind of the physical output. So how many rotas you consistently serve on, how much time you're able to give, whether physically you're actually able to serve in the way that the ministry is wanting you to. So um, for example, if you want to serve on the hospitality team, because that's where your gifting is, if one of the requirements is you must be able to put up and down a table for somebody who has pain in their shoulders or something, that's not going to be very practical for them because it would take a lot for them to do that. So these things can be quite problematic in terms of energy and sustainability and accessibility. And that often creates a barrier for disabled people that kind of stops them from being able to serve and lead in church in the way that God is calling them using the gifts that God has given them.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic to dive into, especially when we think about church and how we can be welcoming and welcome people of all different backgrounds into the family of God. And I wonder when it comes to serving people with disability, are there sort of some misconceptions that we make? Maybe some problems in our thinking about how we approach it that churches maybe need to address that they haven't done.
Yeah, so obviously I've just kind of like mentioned all of the barriers, but um, a lot of those things do come from misconceptions, things that we don't realize. And as a disabled person myself, like I don't expect people to realize these things, if unless um, kind of you're in that position, sometimes you don't realize. One of the biggest ones, and we talk about this in kind of our workshops and presentations, we kind of like to reference and ground the work that we're doing in different models of disability. So like the society model, the charity model, the medical model, and then obviously kind of the biblical understanding of disability and how God sees disabled people. So the biggest misconception that often creeps into churches is kind of the charity model, which is where disabled people are kind of recipients of charity and people to kind of be fixed or cured, rather than recognizing disabled people as God recognizes and identifies all of us, which is with kind of no discrimination, and that each and every one of us is made in his image for a great purpose that he has ordained for us, and that we all have something unique to bring and to offer to him to bring him glory. And that kind of like leads into the misconception as well that disabled people are limited by their disability. There is truth in that. There are some ways in which people with disabilities are limited either physically or mentally or emotionally. But that doesn't mean that they have nothing to kind of offer to church, to their Christian communities. And when we kind of talk about that through the roof, we use the passage in 1 Corinthians 12 where Paul talks about the body of Christ and uses the language of different body parts. Each part is different and has a different function and a different responsibility, but all those parts are equally as important as each other for the whole function and work of the body. And when those parts work together, under the headship of Christ, obviously, then God is glorified through that. And the work of his kingdom is done, and his kingdom is added to in number. And one of our values as a charity is kind of that idea of not one of us is more important than the other. We all depend on each other for different things. A disabled person depends in different ways to somebody who doesn't have a disability, but the person without a disability also depends on other people elsewhere. Paul beautifully kind of explains that in that passage, is that no one is more important than the other. Everybody has an equal responsibility, an equal function. And also, it's not just about depending on each other, but recognizing that what we are doing is for God, and it's depending on Him to be able to do what we're doing, not just kind of in ministry, but in Christian living as well. So I think, yeah, that the charity model is kind of a big misconception that sometimes creeps in without us noticing, and then that does kind of feed into that mindset of actually, disabled people are people who are to be ministered to, and we do ministry for disabled people rather than doing ministry with disabled people, with disabled people being involved in that ministry and doing that alongside them.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting and like really fascinating. And I guess it dives into some of the sort of theological aspect of it really. And you've already sort of started to touch on that already, which I think is really excellent. And I think in many senses, I think our approach, our outworking, our praxis is based upon the theological positions that we hold. So I wonder you've talked into some of those already, but just to sort of to go deeper into that, is there any other sort of is there a better way to think through in terms of our theological standpoint around disability? Is there sort of a better way that we can embrace the value, the values of including people of disability? Is there some things that you just want to dive into on that?
Yeah, so obviously I've already mentioned kind of like being made in the image of God. I think that's a massively important thing. Um, Not just in terms of kind of recognizing that everybody is made in the image of God, but also in how we teach that to our congregations. I know I've sat in church services before where the image of God has been taught as a biblical concept and a theological concept, and I've been kind of coming away thinking, "Oh, I don't know if I fit into that image and the way that's been presented." So I think just reiterating that each one of us is made in the image of God, and kind of being careful that when we teach that concept of Imago Dei, we're not kind of, oh, what's the word? Leaving anybody out of that. So, for example, making sure we're not just going down a functional route. So, like when it says in scripture, work the land and rule over it, that's more about what a person is physically able to do. But also making sure we're not just going down the relational route. So, the fact that we're made to be in relationship with each other. When God says it's not good for man to be alone, that focuses on a person's ability to be relational with other people. Because being made in the image of God, it's so much more than those things. It is both of those things, don't get me wrong, but it's so much more than that, purely based on the fact that God breathed his life and his spirit into humanity, which is something that each of us share in, regardless of whether we have a disability or not. Which is why when we're teaching about being made in God's image, it's really important to not just limit our teaching and understanding of the Imago Dei to kind of a physical, functional, or relational view of it, because for disabled people, it is quite limiting. Physically, if we look at the physical view, that limits people with physical disabilities. And if we look at kind of a relational view, it limits people with learning disabilities, mental health conditions, neurodivergence. It doesn't embrace and value them in the same way, because it's not reiterating that point that we're all made in God's image because we have his life and his spirit within us. Yeah, so that's something that I think is a way that we can embrace and value disabled people. There's so many other things as well, as like the way that we kind of talk about sin and making sure we're not implying that disability is a direct result of sin, the way we talk about healing and making sure we're not forcing healing on people. Yeah, they're all really important things to mention, which we probably don't have time for. But yeah, I think for that one is just making sure that we're teaching about the image of God in a way that is going to embrace and empower and value disabled people and not diminish them.
Yeah, I think such an important point there, and I think when we dive into the theological point, as you were talking, I was thinking about um, Paul talking about submitting to one another, and actually that sometimes means in our how we do things. It's submitting to how how can we best submit to people with disability in terms of how, making it not just in terms of accessibility, but in terms of bringing people with disability into the full life of the church, into leadership, into all those kind of areas, because it's actually that they are, like you said, made in the image of God, and everyone, regardless of ability, has something to contribute to that to the body of Christ. So I think it's really like absolutely really important. Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Well, I was having a look through your website, and I stumbled
Yeah.
across something called the ABC framework. Could you just tell me a little bit about that? It seemed really interesting to me. What is the ABC framework, and how can it sort of help churches and help ministers think through how they can help people with disabilities?
Yeah, so this is kind of a bit more of a new thing for us as a charity, our kind of new um, vision, I suppose. And one thing that we do say when we go to churches and we do workshops and presentations is that we are on a journey just as much as you guys are on a journey. And it's a journey from access to belonging to commission, which is what the ABC stands for, which is very cool in my opinion. I think that that is just a beautiful way of thinking
Yeah.
about it. And it's so easy to remember as well, because it's just the first three letters of the alphabet. So access, the idea of that is for everyone to know Jesus, with disabled people being fully welcomed into Christian life. So not like half welcomed and yeah, okay, you're able to come into the building, but actually fully being able to come into the church family, fully being able to come into a relationship with God and being encouraged in that, just like anybody else would be. Um, so kind of like practical examples of that for churches is to, like I said before, look at the physical environment of the building. And obviously, sometimes that is limited by funds and different laws and things like that. Um, so the question I suppose that can be asked there is, well, what can we do with what we have? Rather than making excuses, there's always something that we can do. So like having a hearing loop with clearly marked spaces of where to access it, or perhaps if there is a need for it, getting BSL interpreters, presenting information in a way that people with dyslexia or vision impairments are able to see that clearly, providing quiet spaces, that kind of thing, so that everybody, no matter who you are and what your access needs are, is able to come into the church and be fully welcomed into that life of that church and that church family. And that kind of leads into belonging. We did a workshop a few weeks back where someone said, well, surely access and belonging go hand in hand. And we were like, yes, that's the point. It is. It's to be thought about as this continuous process. So access then leads to belonging, which is for everyone to grow together as the family of God, with disabled people flourishing in Christian community with other people. So that's things like remembering that church is more than just a Sunday morning. So would people with access needs and disabilities be able to access our midweek things where we meet as a church family, like prayer meetings or small groups and social gatherings that happen maybe for Christmas and things like that? If there's an online Sunday morning church service for those who can't make church in person due to mobility issues, are we then providing online midweek things so that our church family that meet online are still included in things going on in the middle of the week? Providing access information for events that are going on outside of church, making sure that if we're running like a youth camp, for example, where we're going is accessible for the person that is in a wheelchair, that kind of thing, so that not only is somebody able to access church, but they're also able to belong to that church family in the same way, again, that anybody else would be able to. And the final thing is commission, which obviously comes from the Great Commission, where Jesus says, to his disciples, go out and make disciples of all nations and baptize them. And this is for everyone to reflect Jesus, with disabled people making disciples, all to the glory of God. So it's not just disabled people making disciples, just to be very clear. Everyone is making the disciples, but disabled people are excluded from that. Just because the way in which they communicate or the way in which they are is different to another person doesn't stop them from partaking in that great commission that we have. And that kind of means in churches thinking about the roles and leadership opportunities that we have. So, are we do we have like a roaming microphone that, we'd be able to put out into the congregation because someone's in a wheelchair and can't get up the steps to lead the prayers from the front? Do we have the um ability to serve people in that way? Do we have opportunities for disabled people to serve in that way? Um, Also important here to mention as well is we have like a catchphrase that we use, which is don't assume, always ask. So it's important that in our leadership teams, in our churches, we don't just assume that a disabled person either does or does not want to be involved in church ministry. Instead, it's important to ask that question and start a conversation with the disabled people in our communities. And from there, you can establish whether they want to be a part of church ministry or how they want to participate in church life and in what area they want to participate. So, like I mentioned before, there might be somebody who wants to serve on the hospitality team, but their mobility is not as good as somebody else's. So, what are the other ways that we could maybe encourage them to serve on that team? How can we adapt things slightly so they're still able to serve, but in a way that is going to fit their access needs and requirements? Um, yeah, just things like that. Just thinking about what would be helpful, but asking the person as well what would be helpful for them, and not just assuming that we know the right thing. And not just assuming as well that just because what's right for one person with autism is going to be right for another person with autism. Everybody is different. No two people with a disability are the same. It affects everybody so differently. So remembering that as well is really important when it comes to all three of those things of access, belonging, and commission. Is to ask the person, the disabled person in your church, what they need. Jesus says it in scripture, and I can't think off the top of my head where it is. But he comes there's a man in scripture, and Jesus says, "What do you want from me?" Asking rather than just assuming that we know what we can do for somebody is the first step, I think, to helping us on that journey of access to belonging to commission.
Yeah, great. And I think it highlights the importance of listening and empathy and starting by saying we want you to be involved in everything that God has for you. And when I think about commissioning, I especially with a movement like Assemblies of God, and we're very strong on sort of missional outreach and things like that, and especially overseas. And I'd love to see the ability for churches across the UK to provide mission opportunities for people with disability, and for that to be a normal part of church life. I think it's just such an inspiring thing to think of it that way, that there's no area of church life that's restricted because of disability. And I think that really reflects, I think, the heart of God and the heart of what the church is supposed to be. So I think really important. I wonder, on that kind of note, and thinking about those kind of things, and maybe on the kind of practical side of things, what do you think? There are some things that ministers can think through that they could help do, so that would help to kind of in that area of inclusion for people with disabilities? Well, there's some sort of practical things that you think would be really important that maybe they haven't thought of before.
Yeah. So well, the main one that I have to mention is to become a roof breaker with Through the Roof. So a roof breaker is our term for a disability champion. You don't have to be called a roof breaker. Some people do prefer to be called disability champions, but we use roof breaker because it comes from that passage in Luke 5 where the friends of the paralyzed man, which we call the original roof breakers, broke the barriers physically of that building so that he could be lowered through the roof and encounter Jesus in a miraculous way that glorified God, in so many more ways. So that's the first kind of the most practical thing that I can suggest is to maybe not ministers themselves. I am married to a a minister, so I know that you are very busy. But have people that you maybe have identified in your church that are also passionate about disability inclusion, or have a pray with your team and think, okay, is there something that we can do here, and become a roof breaker. It doesn't have to be just one. You can have multiples in a church. Sometimes that's helpful because it's easier to, especially if you've got a massive church, it's easier to kind of spread that reach if there's more than one roof breaker. So that's the first thing I think I would say. The second thing is to get involved with training. We offer training. We have so many other organisations that we kind of signpost to that do different training as well. The main thing that we do is we do disability awareness workshops, which are not just for the roof breaker and their team or the minister and the leadership team. It's for the whole church, because as you just said, this really shows the heart of God, and this is something that is massive, and is something that needs to have awareness brought to it, and that's about the whole church being on board with that mission and with that vision, and wanting to move towards disability inclusion, and not just one person. It's like any ministry. One person isn't going to make it work. You have to have the support of people around you. So yeah, booking a disability awareness workshop to kind of start that conversation about disability in your church and Christian community is really helpful, as a kind of starting point for training. And then beyond there, if there's specific areas that you need help with, then we as an organisation are able to signpost to other places that offer training. Um, Use our resources. We have loads of resources on the website. The main three that I can think of, two, I'm going to go with two actually, is the Removing Barriers audit, which is a lovely document. I can't remember how many pages, but it's not that many, so that's quite handy. That takes you basically all around your church, all around the different areas of ministry, and kind of asks you to look at it from the perspective of somebody who has a disability. How accessible is this? Do we have a ramp to get from the car park to the level of the church? Do we have step-free access to the toilets, that kind of thing? Do we have the provision of a quiet area for people with additional needs? And the church toolkit is also really helpful, so that after you've done that audit of removing those barriers, you might think, oh my goodness, we have nothing in place. Where do we go from here? And the church toolkit is a really helpful guide, that kind of tells you little things that can be done for each area of ministry. So it's split into the welcome team, the hospitality team, the children's team, the worship team, the AV team, all the teams you can think of in a church. There is something in that toolkit for each team. So that, again, it's just reiterating the idea of this is something that the whole church is on board with. It's not just one person, because everyone should be on board with it. This is really the heart of God. So yeah, those are the two big resources I think that are so helpful. And you can get those for free if you become a roof breaker. If not, you can find them on the website at our shop. Yeah, they're really helpful. And then just other things like reaching out to people, reaching out to us for support, reaching out to other organisations that you're aware of. I know that you guys at the Assemblies of God have a very helpful kind of page with lots of different links to signposts to different things, reaching out for support there. And to friends and family members that you may know of who might have a disability, ask them, if you were to come into our church, like, how would you feel? Would you feel welcomed? Because that can be the first thing, is if you've not had to experience that before, you wouldn't know. So I think, and also just kind of like we said before, listening as well is really important. All ministry is people focused. So listening and being empathetic and understanding is massively important, and recognizing that this is a journey. You're not going to get it right on the first day. I don't think I've ever met anybody in church ministry who has got everything right on the first day, because none of us are perfect. So recognizing that this is a journey, and this is kind of the beginning of a conversation, not the end of it, is probably a really important and helpful thing.
Yeah, fantastic. I think getting that that kind of audit and just starting somewhere. I think is probably just the most important thing. I think every church can do one thing to start and to keep that going, to be more to think about inclusivity for people with disabilities. So absolutely fantastic. Grace, thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with me. And I think what Through the Roof are doing is so important, and raising such important awareness and providing tools and resources that can really just help churches. And I said to you before the podcast, this is all in kind of aid of our continuous professional development platform that we run. And one element on that is we help people grow in different areas, and one of those areas is people. And we can often think about it maybe in terms of, staff engagement or volunteer engagement or something like that. But actually thinking about areas like how can we best serve people with disability in our congregations, so vitally important and such a brilliant area of development and growth for ministers. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, and thank you for suggesting cake as a dessert. Of course it's a dessert. It's a very important dessert, and I'm now want a piece of cake. I'll have to see if I've got any in the house. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll catch you again soon. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of That CPD Show. For more episodes, why not subscribe and give us a review? It really helps us out. See you next time.